I now give the floor to the representative St. Kitts and Nevis on behalf of CARICOM.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I have the distinct honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. CARICOM commends you, Mr. President, for convening this very important meeting to address the specific challenges of middle-income countries, MICs, in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, we have long emphasized that CARICOM's critical economic situation has and continues to be compounded by the advent of graduation or differentiation. Most of our member states have been categorized as MICs and are limited in pursuing critical development programs and policies under the current criteria to measure and classify development. One such challenge is our inability to access concessionary funding and certain types of development assistance. Added to this is our extreme vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters. Over the 2019-2020 hurricane season, the region experienced 9 hurricanes at Category 3 level and above, and a record number of named storms, the 5th consecutive above normal season in our history. Some of our countries have experienced firsthand the devastating impacts these intense weather events can have on our people, livelihoods, and economies. In many instances, these natural disasters have wiped out more than the entire annual GDP of a member state. In April 2021, the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines has had a widespread impact on the country's people, infrastructure, and economy, which would cost the nation 50% of its GDP, further pressing an economy facing a high debt-to-GDP ratio. During these challenging times, it is the most vulnerable groups of the population, the poorest, the women, the elderly, and children that suffer the most. As we contend with reconstruction from these natural disasters and other exogenous shocks, we are forced to source funding at higher rates and with shorter repayment terms, thereby contributing to our already high debt burden and further shrinking of our fiscal space. Mr. President, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, CARICOM economies were consistently maintaining a positive growth. However, due to the severe socio-economic fallout from the pandemic, we have found ourselves particularly strained in our ability to keep our economies afloat and to implement the necessary policies for short to long-term recovery. For instance, our quest for COVID-19 vaccines at concessionary rates is severely hampered by the middle-income classification. We are therefore forced to purchase vaccines at commercial rates at a time when our economies are stagnated due to the decline in inflows from foreign exchange, especially from tourism and other exports. Further, In the absence of long-term debt relief and debt restructuring initiatives, as well as limited interest by developed countries to provide additional financing through appropriate facilities, CARICOM faces the grave possibility of a systemic debt crisis with many corporate and sovereign defaults in the short term 2021 to 2022 financial period, and perhaps also in the medium term. This would undoubtedly place additional constraints on our ability to effectively access finance needed for recovery, resilience building, and sustainable development. We are particularly concerned that MICs and SIDS have been excluded from assistance at a time when the gap of inequality is growing. CARICOM is convinced that an effective response to the crisis that the region is encountering should include the use of multi-dimensional vulnerability criteria to assess the risks developing countries face, instead of the antiquated measure of per capita income currently used by international financial institutions to determine access to concessionary finance and development support. Mr. President, it is important for us to recall that MICs represent 75% of the world's population and 1/3 of global GDP. Therefore, effective support to MICs is systematically important in several key areas, including international economic growth, economic and financial stability, environmental protection, and increased social well-being. For CARICOM, building fiscal and financial resilience and investing in preparedness, be it physical, health-related, or social safety nets, are critical to reducing the large human and economic costs caused by climate change. Although we aim to develop new sources of economic growth and high productivity jobs, this requires significant investment in people and climate adaptation, improving the investment climate and connectivity, and safeguarding the environment. However, our efforts to this end are severely hindered by this middle income classification. Mr. President, in conclusion, our region finds itself in extraordinary circumstances, which therefore require extraordinary solutions. CARICOM insists on the development of new ways to classify economies for the allocation of development financing, which is intrinsic to our recovery, especially as the community continues to face multiple challenges, including the ongoing climate crisis, the evolving coronavirus pandemic, and its induced development emergency. I thank you, Mr. President.